It's really my pleasure to introduce Michael Duke this morning. Michael is a close friend of mine. I'm excited that he is back again to present to the Qualitative Working Group, this time on a topic that we know there is a lot of need for information around thematic analysis. So please know that we're aware that many of you need training in this area. Michael is not going to be able to fill all of your needs in this 1 hour, 1.5 hour session. So if you need more, please be in touch with the Qualitative Working Group so that we can really establish what the demand might be so that we can plan for longer workshops in the future. And so my name is Kim Kester, and I, along with Julia McCoy, run the Qualitative Working Group. And we are, well, I'm affiliated with UCSF. Julia has moved on, and Julia is now in Oklahoma, but she has maintained her connection to this group, and I'm grateful for that. This morning, Michael Duke joins us. Michael is the Qualitative Director, the Director of Qualitative Research at the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative, and that is here at UCSF in the Center for Vulnerable Populations. Michael is a medical anthropologist and a methodologist, and he has expertise in qualitative research, of course, but also in mixed methods. And Michael has done a mixed methods seminar for this group that happened a couple of years ago, and we may need to revisit that and offer that again in the future, FYI, Michael. So Dr. Duke's research seeks to identify the ways in which particular structural conditions and policies negatively impact the physical and mental health of low-income populations in the US, including people experiencing homelessness, immigrant populations, and low-wage workers. He's particularly interested in interrogating the relationship between structural vulnerability, housing, and working conditions, and drug and alcohol use. So Michael, Julie and I asked Michael to present this morning on thematic analysis using work, his current work as an example. So to really just ground it in the reality of the kind of data he is collecting. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael. And thanks all for being here.
Great, yes, thank you, Kim. And I'm really happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk about methods. And so, yeah, hopefully this will be kind of a productive conversation. Let me do the share screen thing, and we will get started. Okay, so, oops, here. Slideshow. Okay, great. So hopefully everybody can see the slides here. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about some of the kind of processes around thematic analysis, and we'll use a case study from a study that we just submitted the manuscript a week ago, 2 weeks ago. So hopefully, knock on wood, that will get published. But one of the reasons that and I don't have a sense at this point of where people are in terms of if they've done this kind of work before or haven't done it, but I often find when talking to colleagues, especially people who are kind of statisticians or people who don't do qualitative research, that there's just a lot of mystery around, like, what do you mean by thematic analysis? I mean, it almost sounds to people like there's some kind of dark magic or something that's attached to it. And so one of the goals, I think, here is to kind of demystify the process, but also we'll try to talk about the process in a way that where you can be kind of efficient in doing this work. Because one of the challenges of qualitative research, as many of us know, is that you just end up with reams of data, right? Whether it's interview transcripts or whether it's field notes, you end up with lots of text, lots of things to cull through. So a goal of thematic analysis is sort of data reduction to kind of be able to manage this stuff, but also the corollary to that is to be able to take these materials and to draw particular kinds of conclusions from them. So yeah, so here we go. So the things that we're going to be talking about today is, again, providing this general overview of thematic analysis. An important part of thematic analysis has to do with coding, and we can if people want to talk more about it, but I'm not going to get so much into the mechanics of coding per se as a process, and more talking about coding, how you plan for coding, like the kind of framework you put into place to code materials. And then, we'll provide a case study again on this particular project. One of the things that why I was thinking about this particular project is that we had a method or an approach where we moved from coded material, right? We went and coded a bunch of interviews and stuff, and moved in towards themes. So one of the things that often people wonder about is like how you make this transition between coded material and themes, because themes are really the heart of qualitative analysis. Actually, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the term analysis in terms of qualitative research, because it really is more interpretation. But for the sake of consistency, we can call it analysis for the time being. So the goal of the overall study that we're going to be talking about today is, so some of us remember, it seems like it happened ages ago, but a mere 2 years ago, where things were shut down because of COVID, right? And people didn't, and it happened suddenly, and yeah, it came as a shock for many people. And so the goal of this study was to learn how older people with a history of homelessness, what was their situation like during the COVID lockdown? What did they think about it? Like, what were the things that were difficult for them? What were the things maybe that were, beneficial to them about being in lockdown? But all those kinds of things. As you can see, just from that study goal, this was a very kind of exploratory, open-ended study, right? I mean, we didn't have any particular kind of hypotheses or going in. We just wanted to find out, like, what's it like for people? What's going on with them? So so right now, as you see, I'm talking about the project itself, but once I set up that framework, I'll then go and talk a little bit more about like the principles of coding and other kinds of things. So the study population for this project was drawn from a large longitudinal study of older homeless adults called the Hope Home Study. So in that study, in the parent study, people were recruited from Oakland in California. There were 2 waves of recruitment. One that happened in 2013, 14, and then 17, 18. So altogether, an N of 450 in this cohort. So in terms of eligibility, so I regret to say, for those of us who are either approaching the half-century mark or who have gotten on the other side of the half-century mark, that in the world of homelessness, 50 is considered elderly. And so the eligibility is that people were at least 50 years old during that first wave, or 53 in the second wave, right? So the idea being that people started out at this kind of baseline of being at least 50 years old. That they were homeless at baseline according to the Hearth Act. So that was the eligibility requirements. They were kind of elderly and were homeless at baseline. So for the qualitative study, the data collection for that took place during the summer of 2020, and it's done mostly by a pair of medical students who we were working really closely with and who were interested in, kind of developing their chops in homelessness research. So it was collected during the summer of 2020. We used the outreach. We have these amazing outreach workers in the Hope Home Study who went and looked for people to participate in this qualitative study. And so the sampling that we used was based on people's current housing conditions, because even though at baseline in the longitudinal study, the parent study, people were all unhoused over the course of time, people's fortunes changed, right? And so we ended up recruiting some people who were currently housed. And by housed, that could mean they live in apartments, they could live in houses. Some of them live in SROs, which, yes, technically is housed, but it has its own challenges. The second population were people who were unhoused at the time we interviewed them. And then the third group of people were folks residing in shelter-in-place hotels. So those were hotels that in California and elsewhere that were kind of commandeered by the state. These were, because at the time, if you remember, people weren't traveling, and so hotels were empty. And so they were kind of commandeered by the state to house people who had particular kinds of health risks that would leave them vulnerable to COVID. And one of the health risks is being elderly, right? So some of the folks residing in these SIP or shelter-in-place hotels. We oversampled women because in the parent study, the majority, probably, 70% were men. And the interviews were audio recorded and transcribed. Okay. So let's step back a little bit. And yeah.
Can I just ask, were the interviews done in person?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Kim. So no, because of the protocols in place at the time, these had to be done over the phone. And so actually one of the criteria for the study was they had to have access to a phone. So yeah, not ideal because we couldn't see people while we were interviewing them, but that's kind of the world that we were in at that time. And hopefully we won't be in that world again. Did anybody else have any questions before I go on?
I just will say that there is research to suggest that phone interviews and face-to-face interviews produce the equivalent quality of data. So I know you said it's unfortunate that you were on the phone, but I would say that I think there are benefits to being on the phone while conducting interviews as well. So yeah, anyone who has to do phone interviews, it doesn't mean it's a weaker form of the method.
No, great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for saying that, Kim, because we found that to be the case. So, the one exception to that is that the quality, the audio quality was not as good as it could be. And, when you get things transcribed, you want to have the recording itself be as pristine as possible. So yeah, the quality, the audio quality was a little rough, but I agree. I think the content was actually quite rich in a way that we were pleasantly surprised about. So let me step back a little bit from the study for a moment and just have some notes about coding. Now, we're not going to, we can't, again, if people want to talk about it, we can get in the weeds a little bit about like the coding process, but just some kind of baseline things, common understandings would be helpful, I think, here. So as I said in the beginning, it's really important to have a strategy going in, a coding strategy. Because you want it to be as efficient as possible, but you don't want it to be so efficient that you're blinded to kind of serendipitous or kind of surprising and interesting findings, right? So you want to kind of strike that balance between, having an approach that's going to gets you through the coding process, relatively efficiently, but you also want to have ways in which counterintuitive findings, other kinds of interesting kind of information are still allowed or able to kind of manifest themselves. So here's, a little bit of a soapbox thing for me. So when you have codes, like, is it better to have like a lot of codes for a project or a few, or, a smaller number of codes? Generally I fall under the smaller camp. The debate in qualitative research is this debate between what they call lumpers and splitters. Lumpers being people who lump together a lot of stuff into single code, and splitters, you have a bunch of codes. And even though I hate the term, I'm a proud lumper. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that there's research to suggest that when you have people coding material, that once you reach a certain number of codes, that coders can't keep those in their heads as well, right? And so some of the research suggests like 40 codes, maybe, or 45 is the maximum. If you get much beyond that, coders, even if they have the coding list or manual in front of them, coders can't keep more in their head than that. Now, part of this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but like part of that approach where you create a lot of different codes, that comes out of grounded theory to some degree, right? The idea that in grounded theory, I'm oversimplifying, but the idea is that you go into a project kind of cold, right? You're open to, that you don't have any preconceived notions going in. And so one result of that is that you have to create a lot of codes. There's a recent paper by Detterding and Waters that talks about the fact that grounded theory, came to pass at a time when people had to literally hand code things. There wasn't software to be able to assist you in coding materials. And so you weren't, at the time when grounded theory happened, people weren't able to utilize the kind of functionality of qualitative analysis software in an efficient way. So for example, if you code a segment of, whether it's an interview or something, you can use more than one code. You can double code it. And that way you can go, rather than creating a code that's like, good things about healthcare and bad things about healthcare, right? You could have a single code that's healthcare and then have something that's like good and bad. So you double code it. So it's just more efficient. But the other piece is that, and this is where the strategy comes in, is that if you start off with fewer numbers of broad codes, that doesn't preclude you from later on going back and doing a secondary round of coding that's targeted to particular types of topics of interest. And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at in this project. We started out with these broad codes. We started to see like kind of themes start to emerge from those codes. And then we did the secondary coding on a narrower subset of the data. Okay. And so this is just more kind of the mechanics of coding. Just the fact that it's important to be consistent in the coding decisions that are made, regardless of how many people are coding. So, if you're coding by yourself, and I've done this many times, like, if there's not the budget or the staff to do the coding for you, you need to avoid what's called semantic drift. And that is like that after a certain period of time, you may code similar types of information differently because through the course of reading and rereading the transcripts and other kinds of materials, you may conceptualize a code differently than when you started. So you have to figure out ways to account for that. If you have multiple coders, there are a number of kind of standard strategies for how you make sure that people code consistently. I mean, there are in many of the software packages, or even in standalone things, there are tests of congruence that you can use. Basically they're either like kappa scores based on like a sample, having the same people code. Two people code the same segment of text, and then you run a statistical test. I don't tend to do that often, but that's something that's out there. Another approach is to have two, like a primary and a secondary coder. So somebody will do the initial pass on the coding, and then the second person will review those coding decisions. And if there's a discrepancy, they'll kind of come together and like discuss them, that kind of thing. So one of the things that people often ask about is, the difference between a code and a theme. And again, I mean, some of these are just kind of semantic, but in the current discussion, this is important because what we're trying to talk about is moving from codes to themes. So let's just take a second to talk about that distinction. So a code is, these are basically kind of labels that you use to highlight, patterns, right? Patterns. But the couple things that are important about that is that these are patterns within an individual kind of piece of data, right? Whether it's an interview transcript, a field note, that kind of thing. There'll be a statement, and then you attach some kind of a identifier to that statement. And this, this graphic is actually, sort of relevant in the sense that, before there was qualitative software packages, Post-it notes and highlighters and stuff were the way that you coded material, right? That you would literally have these labels, that were Post-it notes corresponding to particular pieces of information. So, for example, like you could have a code that, but people are talking, there's an interview statement, piece where people are talking about like taking the bus to go to a doctor's appointment or having to take a lift or something. And so like every time somebody would talk about that kind of phenomenon, you would attach this code called transportation to those statements. A theme, on the other hand, rather than being usually a one word or two words like they are in a code, themes are statements, and they're statements that kind of illustrate patterns that you see across the data, right? So not to say in the individual interview, but across all of the interviews, all of the field notes, et cetera. So in this case, like an example of a theme would be transportation as a barrier to healthcare treatment. So in some ways you can kind of imagine that like that theme is the equivalent of, in your results section, you would have subheadings that would talk about the main kind of findings of the study. And using that approach where you actually have them as statements is also generative that way, because that, in some ways, once you identify the themes, like that's the outline of the paper, right? Or at least the outline of the results and or discussion section. So hopefully people understand that distinction between codes and themes. And so, and you get the themes by looking at coded material.
Michael?
Yeah.
Can I just ask you a question to reflect on? Why is it, do you think that, for example, students in our course, Michael and I teach a course on qualitative and mixed methods. What do you think, why do people mistake codes for themes? Because that's the direction it moves in, right? It's people think that they refer to their codes as themes, and
right.
That just is, it's such a common default. And I wondered if you could just reflect on, what do you think, what's under that? Like, why are people confusing these two things?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, because they really represent different stages of the interpretive process, right? I mean, I have a theory that is backed with no data whatsoever. And my theory is that, all of us, at some point, whether in high school or college, we've taken like a literature class, right? And so, it's usually this assignment like where you're supposed to like identify the themes in Moby Dick or in, take your pick, On the Road, whatever the particular thing is. But that exercise is pulling out themes from one single source, right? Like, it's On the Road, right? Like all the themes are in On the Road, disillusionment with, conformity and like discussions of masculinity, that kind of thing, right? Those are the themes, right? In the work we do, though, themes take place across multiple things, right? And so the analogy, the more apt analogy is like, what are the themes across all of Jack Kerouac's novels? Like how, that kind of thing, right? And so I think sometimes people get stuck on themes as like, every time I'm looking at an interview and people say something, that's a theme. And it's like, that's just my theory. But so I don't really know, but for whatever reason, people are a little bit challenged by that. I mean, in some ways it's just two steps in the process. Like codes are sort of like, the Lego pieces that you're putting together, and the theme is like the thing that you build from those Lego pieces, I guess. But,
Yeah, that's helpful.
well, I would be remiss though if I didn't, even though we're going to be talking mostly about coded material and stuff, I would be remiss if I didn't at least touch on the issue of memoing as a way of moving forward in terms of theory testing, developing themes, et cetera. So, and for people who haven't done that, memos are it's exactly like you would imagine, right? It's somehow writing down your impressions about the data as you're kind of confronting it or as you're delving into it. And so most, I guess all of the kind of qualitative software packages have like ways that you can attach memos to things. And so you can attach them to a single quote and say like, oh, that's a great quote. We should use that in a paper. Or you can attach the memo to the entire document, that there is something interesting about this case study. But where it's really useful in terms of when you use these software packages is that they almost all allow you to be able to look at all of the memos at the same time, right? And so when you do that, you're able to kind of see the kind of history of your thinking and your team's thinking on what the data is expressing, what it's telling us, and hunches that people have that may turn into hypotheses, things like that. So that's another approach that's it's pretty invaluable in terms of trying to make sense of the qualitative data. So, okay, so let's go back to the coding business. And so, one of the ways that people organize codes like in their heads and to their teams is with some kind of a coding list or coding manual. People use those terms interchangeably, really. But a coding manual, if you want to use that term, tends to consist of 2 to 3 parts, right? One is the code name, which is the gloss that we use. So if you remember before, we mentioned transportation as a code name. More important than the name, though, is the definition. Like you want to have, because you want to include some kind of statement or a series of statements that talk about what do you mean when you apply that code. If transportation, does that include all sources of transportation? Does it include walking? Is walking transportation, or is it something else? And so you have to kind of come up with agreements with the group of people that are coding of like, when is it appropriate to code something as transportation? Sometimes, so I don't do this too much, but sometimes, especially when you bring in coders who weren't otherwise involved in the data collection at all, it can be useful to have a third. These are tables usually, right? And having a column where you give an example of text that should be coded that way, right? And so if there was a statement that from one of the interviews where people were talking about like, needing to take the bus to get to an appointment, you would include that statement, that quote, and so that the coder would know like, oh, okay, when people are talking about buses and other things, that means transportation. So let me just give, you can take a look a little bit at least an excerpt of the coding manual, coding list that we used for this particular study. So these are color coded, and I'll talk about those in a second. But you can see that this is just created in an Excel spreadsheet, and so the code is the first column, and then the definition or the description is the second. Okay, so the green are what I call kind of characteristic codes, or demographic codes, you can call them. They're about like the particular characteristic of that person, especially if, keeping in mind at this point, we're just talking about interviews rather than observation or other qualitative stuff. So the characteristics of the person. So as we talked about in the beginning, one of the criteria or the ways, not the criteria, but one of the characteristics we were looking for is differences between people based on their housing status. And so housing, right? Were they housed or unhoused, SIP hotel resident, gender characteristics. We also had race or ethnicity, which I should put on there. Well, nearly all of the participants, nearly all, except for a handful, were Black or African American. So how you handle these codes, it depends on the software package, but most of the time you're able to kind of attach those characteristics to the entire document. So like in Deduce, they call them descriptors. And in Atlas, they're called either, I can't remember if they're called code families or super codes. I can't remember which one. But the idea is that you attach it to the entire document. And so that there are a couple of benefits to that, right? Well, first, as you can imagine, now we can compare responses from people who are housed versus unhoused, for example. But it also, provides you some, useful kind of quantitative data for when you're describing your sample, right? So, this graphic was just pulled out of Deduce, right? So we knew the number of people that were in each category, and you could see, and you could do similar things for gender, race, ethnicity, et cetera. So at the second group, and I just use these myself, this is not everybody does these, is I have these kind of generic codes that I use that I call attitudinal codes, because in almost any study you can imagine, like you want to find out, like, do people like something? Do they dislike something? Like, do they have a problem with it, right? And so I have these codes that are like positive, right? For when people say any kind of positive evaluative statement about anything, or vice versa, negative statement. And so you may think like, well, that seems like really broad. Like, what can you do with that? Well, this is where when you double code things, you code the same segment of material with more than one code can come into play. So, for example, if somebody was talking about, if you remember at this time, getting a COVID test was not fun. That you really had to stick that thing way deep in your nose. People hated it. People would often talk about it. It felt like it was puncturing your brain, right? So you could imagine, like, if people were making statements like that in the interview, you would double code that segment as testing, right? As you can see, part of the way down, there's a code for testing, and negative, right? And so then, you could later on take a look and compare, like, what are the differences between people who like had positive things to say about the testing and people who had negative things to say about the testing. So attitudinal codes are really valuable for that, like for double coding it with other kinds of issues. So here, we have what I call deductive codes. And so these are codes that are really just based on the questions that you're asking, right? So these codes come right out of the interview guide or the interview questions. So in some sense, you could already kind of create this list of deductive codes before you even do any interpretation at all. They're just based on the questions. And so as you can see, and here in the blue sections, that a lot of times it refers to particular questions, right? So vaccine, the question 9 talked about vaccines. And so we created a code for that. Well, let me just show you how that works, and maybe in a little more concrete way. So here are a couple of questions that we used for that came out of the interview guide, right? Directly from the interview guide. And so and so we created some codes to go along with that. So one of the questions, so what have you heard about COVID, also called the coronavirus? At that time, if you remember, well, maybe even now to some degree, there was a lot of misinformation, lots of conspiracy theories about COVID, like where did it come from, that kind of thing, right? So based on that, on this interview question, regardless of how people answered it, but just based on the question, we came up with a couple of codes, right? One is knowledge, knowledge about COVID or other kinds of issues. We also had information because at that, well, even now, like the people's sources of information was really important. Like, were they getting information kind of online or like some kind of conspiracy theory sites or Fox News, to be honest, I mean, to be blunt about it. We wanted to know that kind of thing, like where were the sources of information and how did that correspond with their understanding of what COVID was all about? So another example, so, since you first heard about COVID, what have you been doing to stay safe? And then tell me more about that. So just based on that question, we came up, with a couple of codes for that as well. So one is safety, right? Anytime people talked about like feeling safe, feeling unsafe, well, that kind of thing, that would fall under safety. And risk, when people talked about things that were risky to them, like there were people that would talk about like having to work, because some of these folks were frontline workers, right? And so they would like, every time I go to work, I feel like I'm taking a risk because, I'm being exposed to people that aren't wearing masks, that kind of thing. So starting off with these deductive codes is kind of, a little bit like low-hanging fruit, right? Because you can come up with the codes without even having started coding any of the material already.
Michael,
So yeah, go ahead.
Ask you, I don't remember from the deductive code list whether COVID itself was a code.
Yes, it was a code.
Okay, because then I wondered, then were you also applying to double coding knowledge if it was related to COVID knowledge?
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Yeah, that's right. I mean, in some ways, the entire interview could be coded as COVID, because that was the topic. But you're right, because sometimes people talk about knowledge about other types of things that were maybe only tangentially related to COVID, right? So somebody, if, for example, somebody was talking about knowledge about the healthcare system, how you would end up getting services, like then we would code that as like knowledge and healthcare, and that wouldn't be COVID. But if somebody was talking about knowledge and COVID, you're right, we would have coded that as COVID and knowledge, or COVID is, yeah, that kind of thing. So then, but it's true that some people, like if you're, really trying to cut corners on time, people they just use the deductive codes and that's it, right? I tend not to want to do that if that's possible, because new things come up in the course of interviewing people, as we all know. And so we want to account for that. And so the inductive codes kind of emerge in the process of doing the coding. You're going and reading the material and new topics come up, right? Or new variations on topics come up. And so these were some inductive codes that emerged in the course of reading the transcripts and talking about them. And again, the distinction between these two aren't super important, deductive versus inductive, other than deductives are sort of like the equivalent of your kind of, understandings of the kinds of information that you might get, because you're asking questions about it. And inductive are additional sources of material that turn out to be important, right? And so, we didn't ask about spirituality, for example, but it came up a lot that people talked about faith in God or pray, that kind of thing as a way of getting through that kind of thing.
So
okay.
how many codes did you have, Michael?
I think we ended up, around 40-ish, 42, 43, something like that. So, not too many, but it wasn't none. But,
I mean, that, it's not a skinny code book, but it's
not right.
But it seems manageable.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really the issue is about managing. Not to get off too much on an aside, but like when Kim and I first met, we worked at an organization called the Hispanic Health Council, and which was a social service and research center in Hartford. And we had a sister research organization called the Institute for Community Research. Both organizations were doing kind of similar research around HIV risk, drug use, that kind of thing. And so we had this idea, like the first week I was there, I went to this meeting where the idea was like, we're going to create this code book for every possible study we will ever do. And so they ended up with about you know, and there were all these meetings to hash out the codes, and there were like 350 codes in there, and like that just did not go well. Nobody, you know, most of those codes never got used. It was a mess. And so I think that experience told me that, like, yeah, you want to have it be, your coding list be robust, but you don't want to go beyond that. Well, some of this stuff is a little bit kind of abstract right now, but let me kind of walk through how some of this applies to this particular study that we were on, you know, elderly people experiencing COVID. So one of the things that in the context of both coding and then like rereading the coded material that came up was this issue of telehealth. Now, we didn't code anything for telehealth. That wasn't on our radar at all. But it became clear that that was something that people wanted to talk about and had things to say about. So yeah, so when we were looking at, for example, we had, for the sake of for coding, we kind of distinguished between mental and physical health, even though we know that that those are a little bit porous. But we noticed when we were reading all the coded material that was about physical health and mental health, that people kept talking about telehealth. And in some ways that makes sense because, as you know, that in-person appointments became very hard to come by in the context of COVID. So one of the things we did, the first step was to add telehealth as a post hoc code, right? And so we went and looked at all the physical health and mental health material. And when people talk about telehealth, we would add that as a code. Now, it turned out, though, that as we were digging deeper, that people were distinguishing between two types of telehealth. One was talking to their physician on the phone, like having an appointment over the phone. And another was talking, you know, having a consultation using video conferencing, you know, whether, you know, like we're doing now, right? I mean, that kind of thing. And so we ended up adding, and in most software packages, you can create what's called subcodes or child codes. These are codes that fall underneath the big, larger codes. So yes, we had telehealth as the main one, and then these two subcodes underneath. So here, for example, and this is just a screenshot taken from Deduce of an excerpt, right? So so this is kind of where we first got started. One of the examples we're first starting to see, like, okay, what's up with this telehealth business? You know, so you also mentioned that you had phone appointments with your doctor. Yeah, I didn't really care for that. You know, I'd rather sit there and talk to my doctor instead of the phone thing. And he's saying, you know, the phone appointments, it's like looking at somebody's face, you could tell more and you could understand more where the person's coming from. So there was this perceived kind of lack of communication, lack of being able to have develop a relationship with your provider because it's all disembodied. So we ended up, you know, here again is this moving from codes to themes, right? So a number of themes came up once we started digging deeply into the telehealth issue. One are the challenges of accessing appropriate technologies for telehealth, right? And you can kind of understand why, right? I mean, people who are either unhoused or nearly all of them very low income. They may not have, you know, access to a decent internet connection. They may not have, you know, a phone that would actually, or a laptop or whatever, or a tablet that would facilitate certain types of like video conferencing. So this theme emerged from looking at these four different codes, either both individually and in combination, right? Challenges, physical health, mental health, and this kind of video conferencing telehealth code. So let me show you an example of this. So here you can see the attached codes for this segment, right? Telehealth Challenges, video conference. So, you know, have you made an appointment over the phone with your doctor, like telemedicine? Well, I was supposed to, but they didn't call. And so when I called again, they tried to set up some kind of a video appointment. I either didn't know how to make my phone do it, or it didn't come through right, so it never happened. right? And so, part of the issue is like not knowing whether they have the technology. Part of it is also not being, these are, to be honest, I think people who are elderly that don't have a lot of experience with these technologies. And so didn't know how to, even if they had a phone that could do Zoom conferences, they may not really have a way to figure out how to do it, right? So a second theme that emerged is, so these are perspectives on telehealth for physical healthcare differed by modality. And the reason we're talking about physical healthcare is because the next theme is about mental health. But so the perspectives varied on the modality. By modality, I mean, like, are they talking about using using a telephone and talking to your provider versus being able to access a video conference type of situation? So the codes that we used, again, to try to develop these themes was reading these codes, either separately and or in combination, right? Physical health, the two telehealth ones, the telephone, video conferencing, and then positive and negative, right? So this is where those attitudinal codes kind of come in nicely.
Michael, can I interrupt with a quick question?
Yes, sure.
This is so great the way you're breaking it down for us. And I'm wondering if you can help us imagine, like, in your team, how is the discussion happening and reviewing these codes to come up with the theme? Like, are you guys writing a whole bunch of memos? Are you in a room with a huge whiteboard? Are you like emailing each other your thoughts?
Yeah, well, because it was COVID, we didn't go to a room with the whiteboard. So unfortunately that didn't happen. Yes, so some of it was memoing. A lot of it was just, we just met kind of often. I mean, I always find my personal view is that in conversation is where a lot of these things really interesting kind of insights happen. And so a lot of it was just conversation. We would have we'd have meetings to talk about things we're finding. Then we would kind of go back and like individually go and look, like, let's go, it looks like there may be something about telehealth. Let's all go spend the next week or a few days and really kind of delve into that material. And then we'll meet again and see like the kinds of stuff we're finding. So there's that. And some of it is, because, in the world that we all work in, the end result of these things are products, right? They're papers and things of that sort. And so some of the refinement of these themes also came out in meetings to discuss the paper, right? I think we had a kind of a general sense that, something about telehealth is going to be kind of interesting. And it was in the course of like talking about like how to structure the paper and what the themes of the paper were, that also kind of jump-started some of this stuff.
Thank you.
Sure, of course. So, right, so that was the second theme. And so, an example of that here, so this was one of the few people who actually were able to access a video conferencing, and they had a positive experience, right? And so, they're talking about, they have these Zoom meetings with their provider, and they say, oh, I love them. The times I go to actually in a clinic to see them, it was, I only really need to see them and they need to do a procedure or something, and I haven't needed any procedures. And so, later on, that person was talking about transportation, right? Like that it's just more convenient. I can have this consultation at home. I don't have to go to Kaiser or whatever to do that. So that was kind of another indication. Okay. Over here, there's this part here that's just a list of all the codes, and this is just part of how it looks like in Deduce. Like, and the numbers correspond with the number of times things are coded throughout all of the interviews, right? So age came up as a topic 103 times, for example.
Hold on, Michael. Did you guys you inserted the numbers after the fact? After you applied age to everything, then you
no, this is what it's automatically calculated by Deduce.
Never knew that.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's automatically calculated, but does it automatically display it in this fashion in your code?
It Yeah, it does actually,
Oh.
depending on how you set it up. Yeah.
Okay, sidebar. We'll, yeah, that's
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
Yeah. So in some ways that just looking at the thing, you know, all you, even if you look, if you were, didn't know anything about this, this study and you just looked at the kind of frequencies by which things happen, it's like, well, there were a lot of challenges going on. People talked about their age quite a bit. Like, you know, you would actually get some kind of very, you know, broad understandings of like, what are some things that you're likely to find in that material just based on the frequencies, right?
I wonder if it
yeah.
could potentially induce some kind of social desirability or group bias, like, oh, other people are coding this, like.
Yeah, that's true. You know, yeah, and you're right. And so we don't. I'm trying to remember. Like, introduce it when you're doing the actual coding. It doesn't. It's not like a ticker that's where you see on the side, like, oh, this is the 70th time it's been coded. And so it's usually only when you're looking at the material as a whole that it does that calculation for you. And there may be ways to hide it too. I don't. To be honest, I don't really know. I don't actually use it all that much to be honest, but it just happens to be in the screen grab. So I just wanted to tell you what that was about.
If you're interviewing someone and they have a tendency to repeat the same information, do you code it multiple times or do you only code it once?
Well, see, this is where the frequency, relying on this as anything other than something of interest, can lead you down the wrong path, right? I mean, because in a coded segment, if people are talking about age and that goes on for 3 pages, that gets coded as once, right? Even though the slide, there's hundreds of words on age. If they talk about age in passing in the beginning of the interview, and then later on they say something about age, and then later on they say something about age, that's 3 times, right? And so it's like, does that mean that like in one interview somebody talked about age 3 times more often than in the first one? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? So yeah, you have to take some of that kind of stuff with a pretty big grain of salt, and not, you know, and just accept it for what it is. It's like, this is just like the number of times it was coded that way, not the salience of that code, or like, yeah, that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Sure, of course. All right. So the last theme that came up, I mean, there are probably other ones, but the last thing that we utilized was looking at mental health specifically. And so the thing that struck us is when we were looking at how people talked about physical health, the satisfaction with physical health consultations and mental health consultations, they were pretty different, even when people were using the same modality, right? And so, you know, it turned out, so these are the codes we use, right? Mental health, telehealth, telephone, video conferencing, positive or negative. It turned out that few of, or maybe nobody, was doing video conferencing for their mental health appointments. But people were generally satisfied with their consultations over the phone with mental health providers in a way that it sounded very different than it did with kind of physical health providers, right? And, you know, you can kind of speculate or imagine why that might be. I mean, you know, a lot of mental health treatment is around talk, right? I mean, even if it's around tweaking people's medications, that's still talk, right? Mental health care providers don't typically need to look at you and examine you physically, right? That kind of thing. So here, for example, was a quote where, you know, where people were talking about the not having, you know, that the kind of consultations and things that they were getting through the phone were okay, right? I mean, so this person was saying, like, you know, they had this therapist that they talked to, and the therapist said, like, call me and I'll call you right back, and the person does, that kind of thing. The other thing was that people tended to have pre-existing relationships with their therapists in a way that wasn't really clear with their medical providers, that kind of thing. So just to kind of wrap up, a couple of things. So, you know, this trying to create, you know, strategy of moving from codes to themes. So basically, it really just involves reading and combining this coded material and looking for patterns. I mean, I say it merely combines it, but like that's it. You know, it's kind of not a very short process because it's hard to have too many shortcuts around the fact that you're going to be reading and rereading these materials over and over again until like themes start to emerge. But there are ways that you can kind of cut to the chase a little bit by using combinations of codes and things like that to do things more exploratory. The other thing, I mean, just to kind of reiterate, is that, you know, and I didn't used to do it this way really, but like I've kind of have been converted to this idea of having this kind of two-phase coding strategy, right? Where initially you code very broadly, and then you subsequently narrow, you have, you know, create narrower codes and then subcodes based on the topics of interest, like based on the papers that you want to write, or based on the things that you think from a policy perspective are going to be important. That's kind of efficient, but and also just productive, right? So for identifying, you know, emergent themes, insights, and things like that. So those, yeah, so that's all I have. So I'm more than willing to, you know, answer questions or open up stuff. Yes.
Can you just leave it on your summary slide for a moment?
I can try.
Back, yeah.
So how do I go back here?
Usually there's a faint back and forward space on the bottom right.
Oh,
bottom left.
Okay,
Bottom
let's
left
see.
on the screen, if possible.
Or I'll just do this.
Yeah, you
Okay.
can just.
And
But
yes.
yeah, so I just wanted to ask you about the developing of the two-phase coding strategy where you go through and have broad codes, you know, broad codes, and then dive into a particular set of codes that you're interested in to do more refining and just more careful coding and pulling that data apart.
Yeah.
So I totally agree that it's definitely a strategy that some of us on this call have used together, like Julia and Shannon and I. But I wondered if you could talk about the kind of you didn't show us the interview guide. We did see your code book. So we know that there was a pretty broad range of topics that you covered in your interview guide. So what proportion of the data showed up in the manuscript that is now under review, just as an example to the audience?
Yeah, thank you for that. So, well, a couple of things. One is that this approach maybe also worked better because the initial research question was so broad. If you remember, it was just like, COVID is happening. Like, how are older people with a history of homelessness bearing up to that, right? So one could imagine if you had a tighter research question going in, that you made the two-phase thing may be less important. But to get back to your question, I mean, the telehealth paper that we did, I mean, that's really just a small part of what we're doing. And so right now, for example, we're doing a follow-up paper, not a follow-up, but a paper that's looking more directly at the distinction between people's experiences based on their current housing. Like that really wasn't an important element in this. We alluded to it in the paper, but for this new paper we're working on, we really want to find out in more detail, like how did people who were housed fare relative to people who were in SIP hotels versus unhoused on a number of different dimensions, like healthcare generally, being able to access services, things like that. And so, yeah, so this is actually a fairly narrow slice of the data that we collected on this topic, was this topic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. I think just to tie it back to your point that your research question was incredibly broad. And as a result of that, it's possible that there could be many manuscripts that come out of this because you're investigating such a broad topic and you don't really know how whether the stories are going to quickly go from your broad set of questions where they might, they could have all funneled very tightly into one predominant phenomenon that people were experiencing across the data set, despite having pretty different housing situations. So, but that's helpful. I am gonna ask other people for questions. And Jennifer has a question in the chat. After creating initial themes from your inductive and deductive codes, did you engage in disconfirming strategies as a validity procedure?
Well, usually, I mean, the way I approach that is I always try to identify and account for counter examples of things. I mean, if as a way of kind of as a check on these things, and in most cases across those three themes, I mean, there was some variability. I mean, that, you know, some people's experiences were a little bit different. And so in the manuscript, then it's really just accounting for that variability. So I don't know if that's actually answering the question up, but that is an approach that I use, is to, you know, once we identify themes, and to be intentional about going back and looking for materials that contradict that theme. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the theme is wrong, but it means that, you know, it's kind of a reality check on whether a theme is universal or if it's like a tendency, like that most people experienced or talked about.
That answers it. Thanks.
Sure.
Right. So should we talk about the issue of tendency, and at what stage do you feel like you want to raise a claim to a theme? Do you have to have 10 people have said something similar? I mean, I think this is a quantitative way of thinking about interpretation, and it makes certain people feel quite, you know, just like they're doing the right thing, that their claim, because it's been said by 10 to 15 people out of a data set of, you know, sample size of 20, that you're really confident in that claim. But can you think of times, Michael, where you have felt like there's something really here around this notion and idea that's important to put forward into the world, despite, you know, only a handful of people having suggested that this was, you know, part of their reality?
Yeah, I think, yes. I mean, and this is, you know, goes back to like why I generally feel like that what we do is interpretation and not analysis, because analysis has this kind of, I mean, in some ways it's a little like, you know, one of my professors in grad school said that, you know, qualitative papers is like, it's like a legal brief, like you're a lawyer, like you're making this claim, and like, and here's why I think that's the case, right? And it's not necessarily based on numbers, right? Or it's, but it's just based on this, you know, the persuasiveness of your argument, I think, is what the issue is, right? And so I mean, in some ways, you know, people like anthropology is a discipline, for example. I mean, you know, Kim and I are anthropologists, has one foot in social science and one foot in humanities. And this is kind of this way of thinking about the nature of knowledge and stuff is a humanistic one, because it's not based on like counting so much. Having said that, I mean, you want to, you know, if you interview 50 people and only one person said something, it's like, you know, like how much hay do you make out of that one case, right? And so it is one of these kind of balancing acts, right? I mean, usually like if there's a phenomenon that I'm interested in, like I try to like, sometimes I even like just write it out, you know, like make a scheme, you know, schematic thing on a piece of paper of like the variability in that statement, and see like, is the preponderance of people like in one place or another? You know, and so for me, that's sort of good and like kind of good enough. I mean, as long as you're accounting for you know, people who had different experiences or perceptions, like when you're writing you know, you're not making the case that everybody believed or said the same thing, right? Because even in the case of the telehealth business, I mean, there were a couple of people who had no opinion, or some people who thought the telehealth was kind of okay, you know, not great, but okay. So yeah, so that it's always that's always the hardest part, and the flip side is often the problem. And a lot of times, people who are new to qualitative research feel like whenever they make a statement, they have to insert a quote to back up that statement. Like, but again, you know, the quote is the illustration of the argument you're making. It's not the argument itself, right? And so, so even in terms of like writing, figuring out like when does incorporating a quote, support my case, and when is it just, checking off the boxes of like making sure like that that kind of thing. And there are, I just don't think that there are a lot of, we should be farther along, I think, as a discipline or as a field or as a methodology in terms of like these kind of issues, Kim, I think. And so, somebody needs to write the book on this topic, because I think it's really, that's the area where it gets squishy, and also where when you submit manuscripts to audiences that are not qualitative researchers, people start to like, that they ask these questions, and sometimes, and they're legitimate,
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, well, thank you for reflecting on that. Other questions from our audience?
Sure, I have a question. I was recently doing an evaluation paper of my team, and my team is, probably less than 20 people, and then even the ones that wanted to interview were 10 people. How do you? Okay, it's a lot of mess. It's less people than usual, and the second thing is that I didn't think of recording at that time, so I just did a lot of summary notes, and my hand was hurting after each interview. But how do you do theme? I guess you don't like analysis, so how do you do theme interpretation from such a small N and from not having recordings or the ability to really code, because they're not, or we could add, they're not verbatim. There's no transcripts or anything.
I guess I would say a couple of things. One is that it doesn't have to be interview transcripts. I mean, you can code any kind of qualitative material, and so the notes that you took, that you can certainly code those, right? I mean, people who do ethnography, for example, most of their data are field notes, right? And those are coded, right? And so that piece of it, I wouldn't worry about it. It doesn't matter from a coding point of view whether it's verbatim stuff or if you were just writing things down. There is always a challenge when the N is small, because this is like one of these other issues of like how many people is appropriate to interview for qualitative research. And we just don't have those the kinds of tests that our colleagues on the quantitative side have, where you can kind of predetermine like the number of interviews that you need to be able to have statistical significance. But I think in your case, it's really just a matter of like you just work with what you have, and try to make the strongest claim you can make, but also with the caveat that we only interviewed X number of people. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
yeah, no, that was great. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Michael, yeah, Sarah has a question. She's asking about whether you've seen changes in how much reviewers demand inter-rater reliability metrics for coding versus being okay with coders assessing and achieving agreement versus more informal methods like just discussing, coded.
Yeah, that's a great question. So far, I haven't seen that much demand for using metrics so far. I mean, maybe you've had different experiences, Kim. So far, I haven't found that to be the case. And I have sort of mixed feelings about the inter-rater reliability metrics myself, and the reason for that is that it's easy for the statistics to be skewed. Not to get too much in the weeds, but for example, like if there's a coded segment where somebody's talking about the police, they're being hassled by the police, like my coding style is that I code a little bit of enough contextual stuff. So if I read that material by itself, I'll know like, oh, okay, I get where this is coming from. Other people just do it more narrowly. They just focus on the statement on the police. Neither of those is better than the other. But if I if that me and that other person, you know, did an intercoder test, we would fail, like, right? Or it would show like that you weren't in agreement about that. When we were, it was just like the style was different, right? And so I always have a little bit of mixed feelings about that kind of thing.
Roland?
Hi. I've enjoyed
Oh,
this
hey,
very
Roland.
much. And hey, Michael. Thanks for demystifying.
Sure.
Just to address that
Or
last question,
remystifying.
one thought is, if everyone comes to a consensus on what the coding unit is, like a question and a response, although often it's messier than that, but if that's the shared unit, then that can kind of increase your statistics. You can look better about being
That's true.
inter-rater reliable when at least there's no fuzziness on the edges, like you were just saying. So if everyone agrees with proper turn taking, in reality, of course, there are interruptions and all kinds of things like that that make it messier. But if that's the minimum coded unit, then at least there won't be maybe as much of a disagreement, although that can go back and forth, and so there's no perfect answer.
Yeah, it's a little bit. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a little bit like teaching to the test, a little bit, right? Like, you know, if you know that you're going to be using that kind of a metric of like part of the training would be like not just like identifying statements with codes, but like how much contextual information are you supposed to include and be explicit about it? And, you know, and maybe that's a good solution, you know. Yeah, that's a good point.
Michael, I wanted to ask you, going back to what you were saying about how many people say what, how do you balance that with using terms like, you know, a few, some, several, most? So reviewers won't question that and want you to quantify with numbers.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, all these things are really just like at the heart of a lot of the kind of challenges that we all have trying to get things published. Because yeah, I mean, I have used that kind of terminology of like most people said this, some people said this, a few, a handful, whatever, you know, whatever kind of synonym you want to use. I still feel like that's better than saying, you know, 10 out of 12 people thought this, because even if you're a statistician, you're like, that's not useful information at all, right? And it's like 10 out of 12. I mean, if the N is 12, like who cares? You know, that the 10 did this. Yeah, again, I think the way I try to account for the variability is just to make sure that if it's more of a tendency, like some people believe something, some people believe something else, that I make sure that both sides of that are included, right? And so that that way the reader at least understands, like, okay, people weren't in lockstep about this particular thing. But yeah, you know, I wish I had a better answer, to be honest, Andres, because I've gotten dinged by this sometimes by reviewers myself. So
Thanks.
Sure.
Michael, there's a question from Linnea about, could you please touch on reflexivity when moving from codes to themes? Yeah,
such a great point. And, you know, and that point can't be separated from the fact that reflexivity is part and parcel to the stuff we're doing from the moment we're sitting down to interview somebody all the way to developing themes and just being mindful of where we are relative to that. I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, the pat answer, you know, is to like let the data speak for itself, right? But we know that the interpretive lens that we all have makes that impossible, sort of. And so, yeah, so a lot of times, I mean, I you know, to the degree possible, we all have blind spots, but try to check my biases a little bit. I mean, one of the things that like, you know, in the public health world, we tend to see everything as a problem, right? Like, you know, and so it's easy, for example, not necessarily in this project, but in other projects, to talk about like, problems that people of fall under particular gender categories or race or ethnic categories face. And it's very easy for that shorthand then to become stigmatizing, and so part of it is just awareness of positionality, but also part of it is just making sure that the rhetoric reflects that, at least that attempt at recognizing the positionality. Because there's a long history of misrepresentation of people because whether the analyst, the writer, or whatever was not taking reflexivity enough into account and that positionality.
I would just add, going back to Sarah's question about how are your papers being reviewed vis-a-vis this, did you do your due diligence to make sure that your team was all thinking along the same lines? And when you read about the team and who is carrying out the research, I'm less inclined to care at all about inter-rater reliability if it is a study that's been led by and executed by sociologists, anthropologists. I already know that those disciplines are steeped in really considering and taking seriously reflexivity, and that, there's going to be a baked in rigor. I make an assumption that there will be baked in rigor when approaching the analysis. And so I'm not looking for things like that languaging around inter-rater reliability to make me feel confident that this team did a good job with their interpretation. So it sort of links back to then Linnea's question about how does she write up this small data set based on notes? And that's just about being fully transparent.
Right.
This is the situation. This is who I am. This is why I have this number of people. Here are the kind of data I was able to glean, and here's, my interpretation of those data. So just bringing the honesty forward, which I know that, those of us who are trained in anthropology, that's what we tend to do, right? We are our authentic selves from beginning to end in the process. We don't wash ourselves out, right? So just in terms of, how does reflexivity enter in? It's part and parcel really of who we are as researchers. And if you're, reading an article put together by someone who is a medical student, right, then maybe you might have a different way of assessing the quality of that particular manuscript. And you would be more inclined to wonder about whether there was checks and balances in how they're making their interpretations. I think who you are in the world and in the research really matters.
Yeah, that's true. And the corollary to that, it's off the subject, is also just a composition of research teams, right? And to the degree possible, having people reflect those experiences. In this particular study, the outreach workers were people, all of whom had experienced homelessness in the past, but the interviewers themselves had not experienced homelessness, and I have not experienced homelessness either. And so that, in some ways that's a limitation, right? You could make that claim, right? And partly, this was because this was a research project that two medical students kind of had to do as part of their, their summer training. And so it had that kind of pragmatic, that was a kind of a pragmatic reason why the research team was set up the way it was. But, having said that, we said in the manuscript that the authors in this paper had not experienced homelessness, and people, and then let the chips fall where they may. People may say well, then this is all bullshit. It's you're writing about people who are homeless and you don't buy, and then that's fine. But the importance of due diligence in the written materials and also in group discussions, when you're talking about developing themes and stuff, of just being straight about where your blind spots are, what the kind of claims you can make and can't make, I think are really important to do.
Yeah. 5 minutes. Logistical question. Do you put
in the statement? Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I always have a little bit of an issue with limitation sections. There's sometimes there's a thin line between being transparent and flogging yourself, right? And it's like, I'm, like one of the just it's kind of a funny example is like because the students who are the leads on this paper hadn't written a paper before, like in the limitation section, that they're like, the limitation is we weren't able to interview everybody in the Hope Home study. It's like, that's not, dude, that's not a limitation. That's just like, you're not going to do a qualitative interview with 300 people in 2 months. It's not going to happen. But so the point is like, yes, but I actually, to be honest, because limitations always take place off of the end that nobody reads, and so like when it's something about like, if I don't reflect that community, like I actually try to put it up a little bit higher earlier in the document than that. I guess this is another way of saying
it. In reality, sometimes that's a dialogue between the authors and the reviewers come up with random and often entirely legitimate things the authors hadn't thought of, and then other times it's just one of their pet peeves that you probably have to honor if you're going to get it.
Quite so.
Maybe one more question.
I have a question. Does anybody have recommendations for putting together kind of like a standard guidance for a team that's working on a joint project? So for example, we do a lot of reports for grantees across the state, professionals that write in a lot of narrative. And so then we do try to do thematic analysis for that kind of qualitative portion. But when we're dividing and conquering, sometimes people's different methods actually end up making the project take longer than if one person would have just done it. So we were thinking of coming up with kind of like an outline of just some common guidance for everyone to follow when they're doing these projects. Does anyone have any suggestions instead of recreating the wheel?
You mean like a coding approach is what?
Yes. Yes. I got a lot of great ideas for today from this session about a coding approach, and I think we could put something together based just on attending this. But if there's anything anybody knows about that would be helpful, that would be great.
Yeah, it just feels like there's not really a good, I mean, you can like write up in detail like coding procedures, but it seems like there's not really a good substitute for just like getting the people who are going to do the coding together and having kind of a reality check, and also like, having these kind of exercises where periodically you code the same material, and then you talk about like the discrepancies that you had when you coded. I mean, we do that all the time, which I didn't really talk about very much, especially at the beginning of projects. Like all the coders code the same interviews, and then we get together and talk about them. We kind of resolve differences that we have. And then once it starts to get to the point where like we're in agreement, then people can kind of go on their own and do the coding. But the initial coding, we almost always do, we work on them separately, then come together as a team, and we just go through page by page, like which coding decisions we made, and then come to agreements about it.
Okay, thank you for that idea.
Yeah, I think time together is an essential part of qualitative analysis.
And it's where a lot of the insights come from, right? I mean, it's really in discussion with people who are doing the coding where you start to think about like things beyond just codes themselves, but like themes and things like that.
That makes sense.
Michael, thank you. Thank you so much. This was a really great
this was a lot of fun.
And I did have someone ask about whether you would be willing to share your slides. This is recording and it'll go on our YouTube website, but would you be willing to share your slides was another question.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks for coming, everyone, and maybe see you next month. No, 2 months on the more practical budgeting and planning for qual analysis.